In this tutorial, we will look at how to use the Spring framework inside of Struts 2. For my YouTube students, there will be a link in the description to my Udemy course where you will be able to download the source code for all the examples. These are the steps we will follow. First, we will reuse our HTTP session project. Then we will create a in-memory service store class, basically an in-memory database class. We will add the Spring configuration elements to our web.xml. We will add the service store class to the Spring configuration file, which we're going to call applicationContext.xml. Then we are going to use the Maven repository to figure out the transitive dependencies of the Spring framework that we need to add to our web.inf lib directory. And finally, we will run our Spring Struts app to demonstrate the in-memory store. Okay, so here we are in Eclipse, and the first thing we'll do is copy our HTTP session insurance example. We will call it Struts2 Spring Insurance Agent Register. Now, obviously, we need to rename everything that used to be named HTTP Session Insurance. We'll rename it here. Save it. And we will also rename our package name. Now let's just have a look at our web.xml to make sure there's nothing in there that we need to change. Found something here that we need to change. Now let's see if it runs inside our Tomcat server. That looks good. So the next step is basically we are going to change the logic here when you hit register to actually store it in an in-memory service store. So now let's take a look at what happens when we enter info in this form and hit register. So if you go to the JSP, it goes to the register action, and if we look at our struts config, we see that the execute method on success goes to the thank you page. Let's have a look at the register action. We see this is the execute method, and we have some comments in there. Call backend service to store agent bean info in database. So this is the missing part that we're going to write the code for and use Spring. So we'll start by writing the registration service. So first we'll create a new package. We'll write the register service interface. And we are going to have two methods in here, one to get an insurance agent and another one to save an insurance agent. Now we're going to write our implementation of this interface, which is going to be a register service in memory class. We'll implement the register service. And let's start writing the code. So basically, we're just going to use a static in-memory bean here that will store the agent. We initialize the agent with a static method. And we'll set some values. So if we want to get the agent, we just return the agent that is part of this class. And when we save it, we actually just update the in-memory values. So that provides us with a lightweight in-memory implementation of the service. It initializes it with some values, and it allows us to call a method and update that values. So now let's go back to our register action and add the register service in memory. So we're going to add the register service interface and let Spring manage getting the correct implementation for us. We are going to need to add getters and setters for the register service because we are going to use the old style Spring. And that looks good. So now we are going to set up Spring to manage the register service for us. So we will start with configuration, and the first thing we will do is head to the web.xml and add the necessary Spring configuration in here. So we are going to add the Spring context loader listener. The rest we can leave as is. And then we are going to add an applicationContext.xml Spring configuration file in the same directory. Just going to paste it in. If we look at the Spring applicationContext.xml, we see that we've defined a single bean, register service, and it points to register service in memory. Now what this means is that Spring will manage the dependency of the register service in memory class for us. So when we look at our register action, we see it's defined here, but we don't see any new, which means Spring injects register service for us from that bean. So now let's see what happens when we run it after we've added our Spring configuration. We get a 404 not found, and if we go to the console output, see that we get a class not found exception on this class, which means we need to add all the Spring jars. So when we do a Google search for Maven on this class, this is what we found. So we'll go to the Maven repository, and it tells us that the class that it's looking for is in the Spring Web jar. And since we're still on Java 8, we probably want to go back to a more up-to-date version 4. When we look at version 4.3.20 release, we see we've got a good number of dependencies. So we'll pick this one. And now we will download the jar. And then we will add it to our web.inf lib directory. So now we also need to have all the jar dependencies that Spring Web requires. And luckily for us, the Maven repository down here will start telling us about compile time dependencies. And we see we've got Spring ALP, Spring Beans, Spring Context, Spring Core, So we are going to go download and manually install all these jar libraries into our web.inf lib directory. I will just do one and then skip over the rest. Okay, at this point we have gone through the process of downloading and manually adding all these Spring jars. Now another jar dependency that we are going to have to add to our web.inf lib directory is the actual Struts2 Spring plugin. We will download this jar and copy it into our web.inf lib directory. So at this stage, it looks like we should have all of our Spring and Struts jar dependencies. So we are ready to run it. But before we run it, let's have a look here at our Struts Config. We see we've got an input method that goes to the register JSP page. When we look at our register action, we don't see an input method. So let's add one and let's use Spring to basically inject the agent bean values. So we added an input method to our register action and we call the set agent bean. That would get the agent bean back from the register service. And what this means, it would get the values of whatever is in the agent bean and populate our register.jsp. So let's go ahead and run it. So our dependencies look good. We don't see any missing classes. Now let's see if Spring works. And that means Spring works for us. So we can change the values and hit it and see that it's updated. Turn to main page. And now we see that the values are stored in memory and Spring is managing the dependency injection for us. And that concludes our Struts with Spring tutorial.